Thanks a million. Hi everyone. I really hate giving these webinars because there's no audience feedback, no obvious audience feedback anyway. So anyway, I'll proceed. The topic we're talking about today, I've called it Grid 2.0. It's basically around smart energy, smart grids. I've called it a primer. It's a primer for the actual talk I'll be giving in eTech. It builds slightly on a talk I've given a couple of times last year. So a few quick words about myself. I work for Redmonk, as Catherine said. My contact details are there. I blog on greenmonk.net. I Twitter on twitter.com/TomRaftery. My email address is there. My mobile phone address, or my mobile phone number, is there as well. If you have any problems, any follow-up questions, or anything you want to address to me after the presentation, feel free to get in touch. I see as well from the window that my colleague James Governor has joined us. James will be joining in the presentation as well. So, a number of years back, Nick Carr wrote this book called The Big Switch. And in The Big Switch, Nick posited that internet companies needed to become more like utilities. They needed to change their business model. And great idea, good story, well told. It's happened. Most internet companies are heading towards the software as a service model, and that's all great. In this talk, we're kind of turning that on its head, and we're saying that now the utility companies need to be more like the internet companies. They need to adapt their models, technical and business models, to be more like internet companies if they want to move forward in the emerging world of Energy 2.0. A bit of background on this. This is a photograph of Alexander Graham Bell, widely acknowledged as the inventor of the telephone. This is him with one of his early inventions. If you were to put him in front of any of these smartphones that are on the market today, he'd be kind of scratching his head, wondering what to do, if he even recognized them as telephones. This is Thomas Edison, widely acknowledged as the inventor of the light bulb. In fact, he didn't. He just perfected the invention, but anyway, that's another story. But one thing he did invent was the electrical distribution system. And if you were to put Thomas Edison in front of today's electricity distribution system, also known as the grid, he would recognize it instantly because it has changed hardly a jot in the 100 or so years since he came up with it. So that's because of massive underfunding of the system in the last few decades. In Europe, the average age of a transformer in a substation is 42 years, and the average end of life for those transformers is 40 years. So the grid mechanisms are really creaking at the seams. Electricity 1.0, that's the current situation we have. It's basically a series of LANs, local area networks. In the US, the grid system there is divided amongst about 500 different owners and about 200,000 miles of power lines. A lot of them are not well connected, so you get crazy situations, like you have wind farms in West Texas generating excess energy, and it seems bizarre to be talking about excess energy in this day and age, and you have counties next door to them who are having brownouts because of no interconnect between the two neighborhoods. So one of the first things that needs to happen is that needs to be addressed. Electricity 1.0 is read-only. You just consume, you can't publish to it. It is top-down, it's highly regulated. It's very buggy. You do get brownouts and blackouts frequently. It's dumb. And when I say it's dumb, I mean it's extremely dumb. The current grid infrastructure is such that if there is a blackout in your region, the blackout can be caused by a tree falling, a digger digging up a line, a storm, whatever. The first that the utility company hears about it is when you ring them up and say, "Where's my electricity gone?" There's no feedback through the network itself. They have no way of knowing where the blackout is until the phone starts ringing. And even then, they localize it based on the phone calls, where the phone calls come from. And they send engineers to site to find where it is and to try and find out what's caused the problem, so so that they can then send the relevant repair crews. Unbelievably stupid. It's a closed system. If you want to play in the electricity market, you have to be a large utility. It's very hard to become a large utility from scratch. So it's a closed system. It's very hard to get into it. It's architected for the past. The electricity systems of today are architected for 3 or 4 large generators and multiple consumers, whereas we're tending towards a system where renewables are coming on board, and you're having lots and lots and lots of generators, and they're not. The system isn't architected to handle that, and that needs to change radically. The provision for hits, in other words, and here's the next slide. This is a slide of the hits to the Australian Open website, and I think it's quite telling. It may sound a little unrelated, but if you can see, there are peaks there of traffic to the Australian Open website, which happen every January. Obviously, that's when the Australian Open runs. As a result of that, if you are the webmaster of the Australian Open website, you have to either have a slew of servers capable of handling all that traffic, and as you can see, the peaks grow from year to year, or else you go down the cloud computing route. Similarly, the utilities, there is no kind of cloud computing analogy for utilities yet. So right now, they have to have the equivalent of a slew of servers in place to handle the large hits that happen, say on summer afternoons when everyone turns on their air conditioning, or in winter evenings when everyone gets home from work and turns on the heaters. So they have to.
No, I think to add to that, Tom, and this is James jumping in. I think if we've got anyone English on the line, I would call it the EastEnders effect, which is that basically the entire English electricity network is predicated on delivering a cup of tea when EastEnders, which is a TV show, a soap opera, finishes just after 8:30, I think. There we go, provisioning for hits. So seriously, the English electricity network as a whole is provisioned around, well, 2 things in fact. It's the kettle going on and the toilets being flushed, which generate some need for water pumps to start. And literally the entire UK network is all about that one time, just past 8 of an evening. Clearly, TiVo may have a role to play in helping us out. Anyway, sorry, Tom. Back over to you.
No worries. Feel free to jump in at any time. And then I threw this slide in because then along comes renewable energy. Basically, the utilities hate the idea of taking in renewable energy. Renewable energy, to all of us, is a great idea because it's low carbon, it's carbon free in most cases, apart from the capital cost of building it. But for the utility companies, it's a nightmare to try and add renewable energy sources into their existing systems because they're architected for the past, number one, but also because the renewables are primarily variable. So, and the main renewable, in fact, is wind right now. The other renewable of any consequence right now is solar, but that's of very little consequence in terms of the volume compared to wind. Wind is the main one right now. Wind is obviously extremely variable. It's variable day and night, it's variable summer, winter, and it's variable minute by minute, and that causes massive problems for utilities because they have to try and match the supply of their generation with their demand from people on the grid. So it's hugely problematic for them. Here's an example of some statistics I took. I'm based in the south of Spain. So
Tom, let me just throw this out there. Wind energy is never going to provide enough energy to be really useful in keeping households with their requirements. Wind energy is never going to cut it, Tom. You're wasting time if you talk about wind.
Yeah, James is obviously being a bit provocative there, because he knows full well wind by itself will never satisfy all of the demand. That's true, but wind has a huge part to play in satisfying large portions of the demand. And in fact, what we'll see later on in this presentation is what we're going to do is we're going to massage the demand and move the demand to meet the variable supply. So in this current slide, the renewable energy slide, this is data from the Spanish grid management company. And you can see in the pie chart on the right-hand side that at this particular time that this slide was taken, wind was providing 17% of the generation mix. It was providing about 5 gigawatts. At the same time, solar was producing almost nothing. In Spain right now, there's about 15.1 gigawatts provided by wind, and there's about 400 megawatts, 0.4 of a gigawatt, provided by solar. So that'll give you an idea of the relative penetration of wind versus solar on the world market, because Spain is one of the leading generators of solar right now, and it's coming out around 400 megawatts.
But there are some really, really weird effects in here. So, you know, the simple fact is that, as Tom says, wind is good in Spain. That's a very useful source of energy. Interestingly enough, in Spain, you know, they're not getting a lot from solar, and yet Tom, I believe, just last week was having lunch and got sunburn. And let me tell you, if you can get sunburn at this time of year, then you should definitely be trying to get some sustainables going. I think one of the most interesting effects here has been the provision by governments of basically initiatives and incentives in order to, for example, go solar. So, you know, Tom is there getting a sunburn in Spain. What's very interesting is that the country that has got the most consumption of solar power equipment in the world is Germany. And Germany clearly doesn't have the kind of sunshine characteristics of some geographies where there's a lot more sun. But on the other hand, the German government has made the decision, by investing in supporting solar power, they're going to gain the skills, gain the engineering expertise, and so on, that they can become an exporter of renewable energy technologies. So it's kind of interesting that you wouldn't necessarily think Germany would be a big place to be doing solar power, but because of government incentives, it certainly is.
Sure. And what Germany did was they offered to buy all solar power at 47 cents per kilowatt hour, which is spectacular. In Spain, the government is committed to bringing Spain to 3 gigawatts from the current 400 megawatts by 2010. So we're going to see a lot of activity here in solar in the next couple of years. The situation, and this is a slide taken from the Irish grid management company, EirGrid, you can see why wind is so problematic. This is the graph of energy demand versus energy supply by wind. And you can see they're almost exactly out of sync. Now, this would not be atypical. This just happens to be one day. But this would not be atypical. Wind typically blows stronger overnight. So that's a big problem for the grid management companies. And if you look at the next slide, some statistics, again coming from the Irish market, but again, these are not atypical. In 2006, Ireland had 6.5% penetration of wind, which meant the maximum produced by wind was 0.9 of a gigawatt at the time. The country's minimum demand, so picture a summer night around 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, was 1.8 gigawatts. Now, that 3 or 4 o'clock on the summer morning, when the demand was 1.8 gigawatts, wind could be providing 0.9 of a gigawatt, or 50% of it. So at times, the 6.5% yearly average could be giving up to 50% of the actual demand. Now, the Irish government has committed to moving Ireland to 40% from renewables by 2020. Which means in 2020, at that time it's projected that the demand, the minimum demand on that summer morning will be 3.6 gigawatts, so it'll essentially doubled. But at that time you'll be getting 6.3 gigawatts if the wind is blowing from wind. So you get, almost 3 gigawatts excess. Now, that's obviously hugely problematic for grid management companies, because what are you going to do with an extra 3 gigawatts of wind? It's not like you can stick it in a box and put it on a shelf. You also have the issue that there are no utility-scale storage solutions for energy. There are a couple of things out there. You know, there's this one called compressed air storage, and that's, you know, it's nice in theory, but it would be limited to specific geographies, and there's none available anywhere yet. Basically, the idea is that you compress air and you shove it in a massive limestone cavern underground when you have an excess of energy, and then when the demand for energy exceeds the supply, you spin out the air that's compressed through turbines, and that generates electricity for you. As I say, nice in theory, but hasn't been built anywhere yet. There's another solution, it's pumped hydro. It's a similar idea. You pump water up a hill into a large reservoir, and then you drop it down. So at times of excess energy, you pump the water uphill, and then at times of high demand, you leave it drop back down through turbines again. Now, the pumped hydro is pretty common. So it has been rolled out in a lot of countries. There are a couple of problems with it. It requires a specific geography, so it requires a place where you have two large lakes separated by a hill. It also costs a shed load to build one of these. So, for instance, there's one in Ireland called Turlough Hill, which was built between 1968 and 73 and cost at the time 20 million Irish pounds to build. So, and it has a storage capacity of about 280 megawatt hours. So, small enough storage capacity, large enough cost to build. There might be other places where these can be built, but they're not going to be cheap, and they won't store a huge amount. So they might contribute somewhat to the storage problem, but they're not a long-term solution. So given that there are times when the supply and demand are well out of sync, given times that there are excesses of energy as well as shortages of energy, and given that there are no real utility-scale storage solutions out there right now, you get problems like this current graph here, which is a graph of what's called curtailment. And this is an instance on the 25th of August last year when the Irish Grid Management Company had too much electricity being generated by wind. Well, they had too much electricity, so they decided to cut off the wind farms. So that's that big drop there in the circle. They shut down the wind farms. They shut them down because they're the easy one to shut down. That's not limited to Ireland. That's happened in New York as well. The Maple Ridge wind farm gets shut down. The ones in West Texas get curtailed as well. And obviously it's crazy to be shutting down wind farms which have zero carbon footprint when you should be shutting down coal or gas, which have a significant carbon footprint. So what kind of solutions can we get to get over these issues? There are a number of them. The first one is make it a big network. So make the grid a big network. So I mentioned the US has about 500 different subgrids or owners. In Europe, there are a lot of grids as well, some interconnected, some not. This particular graph, or this particular graphic, has been taken from the site desertec.org, and you can look it up yourself there. It's a large inter-country project to try and build a huge grid linking North Africa, the Middle East, Eastern and Western Europe, and Iceland. And the idea being that you would have different renewable forms of energy in the different places all linked up, so that if it were cloudy in Spain, Spain could still be taking in wind, or sun from North Africa, or geothermal from Iceland. And similarly, you know, if it were cloudy and windless in Ireland, they could be taking in wave energy from off the coast and selling it on to Germany. You know, why not?
And I think one of the things to understand there is this is all nations. You know, this is not just sort of, you know, perhaps, you know, say you're in the UK and we don't have access to one particular thing, or we're, say, in the Middle East, you wouldn't necessarily expect that they would be investing heavily into renewables. You know, clearly, for example, if most of your economy is based on petroleum, the natural thought is, well, you're just going to ride that horse and get as much money out of it as you can. But I think the opposite is in fact proving true. I think one of the things that has really impressed me, certainly looking at what's going on in the Middle East right now, is a significant investment in renewables, renewable thinking, how we can make the most of this real estate where the sun is, and so on. So I think the really interesting thing is that not only is the idea of a technical grid an interesting one, but it's certainly one, or should I say a global grid, an interesting one. It's certainly one that there's political will there that perhaps might not have been expected. So I think that's a real big deal.
Plus, there's this new, and you can see it on the slide there, the high voltage DC lines that they're talking about. And high voltage DC it's a lot less lossy. There are far less transmission losses using high voltage DC lines to transfer electricity than there are with traditional AC lines. Traditional AC lines, you'd get a losses of 10% maybe, but with a high voltage DC, it's well under 10%. So that's why people are going for this technology, because the HVDC has come out.
So, I mean, if you think about the internet, for example, clearly we're not really expecting that all of these networks are going to be there right off, right from the word go. But we do need to start driving this kind of Moore's law effects. I mean, it's very interesting to me that Cisco, for example, is investing heavily in energy routing technology, trying to understand that. What are the implications? Because clearly, at the moment, we are really not very good at transmission of electricity. The state of the art has not changed in a long, long time, and yet we have to think that investing in these kinds of technologies, we're going to get better effects. So I think as much as anything else, if we'd have gone back 15 years ago, we certainly wouldn't have expected the kinds of tremendous benefits that we've had from transferring data. I'm not saying electricity is the same thing, but clearly that is an area where we can invest more and get some significant benefit from. As I say, Cisco doesn't go after things it doesn't think it's going to make a buck in.
Exactly, and as well as then going with a large resilient infrastructure, a large resilient network, the next thing you have to do is you have to use proven principles. And the proven principles I'm looking at here is the market. You've got to turn electricity into a real-time market. And why do I say that? Well, if you look at the graphs on this page here, I'm sorry about the quality of them, it's hard to read them, I know that, but there are two graphs here of the marketplace pricing for electricity in Ireland, and you can see it varies enormously. On the graph on the left-hand side, there are times when electricity is 400 euro per megawatt hour. On the right-hand side, you can see there are other times when electricity is as low as less than 40 euro per megawatt hour. So there's a difference of an order of magnitude between those two price spots. And that differential in the cost of electricity on the wholesale market is never passed on to the consumer. The consumer is never made aware of the variability in the pricing of electricity. Consequently, the consumer, you and me, we don't alter our behavior. We don't change the way we consume electricity because it's the same price. It makes no difference to us. So what we need to do, and what's starting to happen in a lot of countries now, is we need to roll out smart meters and smart grids. The smart meters and smart grids are ways of making visible to consumers the real-time price of electricity. Now, I don't think, well, this slide here is the dashboard of my car. I drive a Prius, and it has radically changed the way I drive because I get constant feedback from the dashboard on the energy utilization of the car. And I'm driving down the road, I'm going to pick up the boys from school or whatever, and I have little competitions with myself to see how low I can get the consumption as I'm driving. Can I get it below 5 litres per 100 kilometres? I live in Spain, as I mentioned, so my car is graduated in litres per 100 kilometres. That comes out at around 50 miles per gallon, I think, roughly anyway. So, but, before I had the Prius, I didn't think about how I was driving. I just put the foot down when I was at the lights, and it never occurred to me. But now I get constant feedback from the car. It changes completely how I drive. Similarly, I think if people are getting constant feedback on the price of energy, and as well as that there's the whole green side of it that people are now becoming more aware of, then people will change their energy consumption habits. I think it needs to go a little further than that though, and we'll get a little bit into that as well. I think that needs to be automated, because people will over time start to drop back and think a little less about it. But there's this technology called demand response. And demand response is a technology that's being pushed by the utilities at the moment in order that they can do this thing that's called peak shaving. If you remember back to the graphs of earlier of the peaks on the particularly the Australian Open website, for instance, those are the kind of peaks that the utility companies are faced with every day. They get peaks of energy usage at around between 12 and 1, that kind of time frame, and also a second peak then around 6 or 7 in the evening. And they have to provision, as James said, for those hits, 8 o'clock in James's case in the UK when EastEnders finishes. They have to provision for those hits, for those peaks. What they want to do is they want to shave those peaks, they want to reduce those peaks, and the lower they can get those peaks, the less extra power stations they have to build and keep online to be in their spinning reserve for when those peaks come on. So demand response is the technology that they're rolling out to meet those peaks and what they want to do, or to shave those peaks. And what they do with demand response is they have programs whereby they say to people, at those peak times, if you come off grid, we'll pay you money. So they're trying to reduce the consumption because they know they have to try and manage the supply and the demand. They can't manage the supply anymore, so now they have to try and manage the demand. They can't manage the supply because a lot of the supply is coming from variable renewable sources. That's unmanageable. So, like I say, they can't manage the supply, they flip over to the other side of the equation and they start managing the demand. Now, with the likes of peak shaving and demand response, there are a number of things that are starting to happen. That you're getting automated demand response programs being rolled out. And they're happening at a commercial scale and also at a residential scale. At a commercial scale, you're getting things like data centers, you're getting large refrigeration plants being involved in it, and these are companies with particularly movable loads. You know, data centers have got diesel generators, so they can come off grid. Refrigeration plants can just suck in energy and store it because they're well insulated for a while. So demand response is particularly suited to those industries. But if you think about the home situation, there are movable loads in your own home as well. And what we're starting to see is things like home area networks being set up using various protocols, whereby you're going to start having appliances in your house respond automatically to differential pricing signals coming from the utility. Those differential pricing signals will be fed down through the smart grid, through your smart meter, into your house. And then you'll have different things in your house subscribing to pricing signals and altering their behavior accordingly. At the moment, the utilities want to control that, but what you're going to start to see happen is you're going to start to see companies coming up with consumer plays where the consumers start to take control of their devices again. So that what you can do is you can have your immersion thermostat change by a few degrees, so that when electricity is cheap overnight, it sucks in a load of energy, makes hot water, stores it as hot water overnight, and then keeps it well insulated during the day. It doesn't take in energy during the day. Fridges and compressor pumps as well, same kind of thing. Freezers as well can take in energy, get very cold when energy is cheap, and then change the thermostat so that they don't come on during the day when electricity is expensive. Dishwashers, clothes washers, dryers, all those kind of things. It should be possible to program them when they become smarter, and they are going to start becoming smarter. It'll be possible to program them to say things like, okay, come on sometime between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. I don't care when you come on, as long as you come on in such a way that everything is done tomorrow morning when I get up at 7. So these are the kind of movable loads that you can have in your own home. There are obvious movable loads, there are obvious loads in your house that are not movable. You're obviously not going to get up at 3 a.m. when electricity is cheap to cook your dinner. That's just not going to happen. So some things you will have to do when electricity is more expensive. What you're starting to see, though, is you're starting to see the move from the traditional push to now pull, in the same way that in the internet originally it was push and it started going to pull. Now in the energy market you're going to start to see the move from push to pull as well. You can get demand stimulation happening in municipal level as well, so the likes of swimming pools can be heated overnight when it's cheap and left to slowly drift back up or back down in temperature during the day. In the home as well, storage heaters are another technology that are well suited for this. Microgeneration, what we're calling the read-write grid, another Web 2.0 analogy, is starting to become a lot more attractive. With the advent of the smart grid, net metering, what they call net metering, in other words, the ability for you to have, say, a turbine, a wind turbine on your roof or solar panels on your roof, generate electricity and sell it back to the grid and get credits for that, get paid for that. That's becoming very much more a reality. It's becoming far easier for the utility companies to meter with your smart meter how much you're selling back and credit you accordingly. The next big thing, though, that's going to be coming up, apart from microgeneration, is what's called vehicle to grid. And vehicle to grid is a really interesting one, because at the start I said that there were no utility scale storage mechanisms for energy. There aren't yet, but imagine if there were a fleet of 10,000 or 100,000 or 500,000 plug-in hybrid vehicles. If you have 100,000 plug-in hybrid vehicles distributed throughout your country, right there you've got a distributed battery bank for your country. So if the government, for instance, were to put in place a kind of a scrappage scheme where they said, if you present us with a certificate of your 2 mile per gallon SUV being scrapped, we'll give you X thousand dollars towards your next plug-in hybrid, then you start to see very quickly people taking up the offer of getting plug-in hybrids. And as I say, they would become a battery bank for the country. James, am I still online? I think I've lost. Hello?
Tom, yes, you're still there.
Oh, I'm hearing a strange noise. Sorry, I thought I
am
was gone.
too. I don't know what that is. So
okay.
Just let's ignore it for now.
Okay. Sorry about this. So yeah, the plug-in hybrid vehicles become de facto a battery bank for the country. They start storing electricity for the country. They can suck in energy at night time when energy is cheap, and then during the day they can sell it back. Why not? And this is something that a lot of the plug-in hybrid manufacturers are starting to think about, and some of the utilities are getting on board with as well, that consumers with plug-in hybrids will be able to sell electricity back to the grid at times when it's cheap. Particularly if you've got a plug-in hybrid, whatever but battery electric, if you have a plug-in hybrid, you have a petrol engine as well, so your car can decide the spot price of petrol versus the spot price of electricity and decide what's the best way to take you home.
And there's all kinds of weird business models that potentially emerge from this. When you look at, for example, Shire Gassie's Project Better Place, that's a thing where basically they're renting the customer the battery rather than the car. So their whole thing literally is about their energy infrastructure, and then they as a business sell their power back onto the grid. So if you're not familiar with Better Place, basically Shire Gassie, he was a guy at SAP, went away, got some VC money, has managed to persuade the Israeli government that it's a very good idea that they need a build out of batteries. And so it's quite interesting. It's sort of this notion of solving two problems. for the price of one. So you not only have an electric car, as Tom says, but you have this distributed battery coming back. And I think it's some of these network-based market kind of information models, and clearly that's where Shai is going with this. Very, very interesting. Very, very interesting because, we had a very good comment that just, here that was energy is free, it's packaging and distribution that's expensive. Well, Steve Giovanetti, frankly, clearly storage is a really, really tough issue in terms of that distribution.
And what's interesting about Project Better Place as well is that they've looked at this on the kind of macro level, and they see that they themselves are becoming energy aggregators. They own the batteries, so they will buy energy to charge the batteries when it's cheap, and they have the option of selling it back or moving the load and becoming spot traders in energy, because they'll have large distributed battery banks that they'll have full control over. Eric Schmidt said it well. Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, and his quote is here: "I could imagine a smart garage where I plug in my car and the computer handles it. I could even make money by cost shifting," and that's what Shai Agafi is thinking as well. It solves energy security, energy prices, and job creation, and by the way, climate change. To know me is to change me. This is a picture of a current cost meter. So a current cost meter is a little device you can plug into your home, your electricity cable at home, the incoming. It clamps on, so there's no great requirement to be an electrician to install it. It's just a clamp meter. And it gives you, as you can see on screen there, it gives you a lot of detail around your consumption. What's happening in the UK, and this device is from the UK, what's happening in the UK is a lot of people are starting to hack this device. They're starting to connect it to other devices. They're starting to look at the output of it and plot the output of it, because you can connect it to a computer and you can get the output of your energy usage over time. So on this particular graph, you can see a lot of mini peaks, which are probably the compressor in the fridge coming on during the day, and then around 5 o'clock in the evening, the oven comes on, and that comes on for about 15, 20 minutes, whatever, and then you're back down to the regular, just the fridge. So
I think given that Tom decided to leave the UK and head off to warmer climes and live in Seville, perhaps we ought to get someone that's actually living here to talk about the current cost meter and the home cap. Because it's a really interesting phenomenon, I have to say. I mean, the question about economies and what are the new business models and how is this going to work and who's going to drive this. It's been really, really interesting to see this thing emerge. So current cost began as a really, really simple device, as simple as it could possibly be. As Tom says, to know me is to change me. It was a thing that was on the wall, and you would look at it and it would say on an hourly basis what your electricity consumption was. Fine, okay. How interesting is that? Not so interesting. Until you do something like this. A guy called Andy Stanford Clark from IBM, and Tom, feel free to, if you need to move some slides forward as I talk through this, but basically Andy Stanford Clark realized that, hang on a second, the data is what's valuable rather than the device. So he asked them, well, could you put an interface on there? Could we serialize it? Could we, for example, think about having the current cost meter pumping this stuff out as Wi-Fi? And clearly, if you can do that, you can begin to do interesting things. And a hacker community emerged, and they began to do these interesting things. So, nobody's asking for permission. This stuff is great because you don't actually need to wire it into the wall. You just go, you walk up, you attach it to your wire, and it begins to create interesting information. You can then begin to take, interesting phones, neat phones, new visualizations. You can begin to share that information with your friends. You can begin to understand what your baseline is. And so what I found most interesting is you had an IBM guy, Andy Stanford Clark, and he actually wanted to get people to understand the value here. His house twitters his energy consumption. So on an ongoing basis, it says what his energy consumption was, what his water consumption is, if the doorbell rings, all of that information when the phone rings. And as he's been known to complain that in fact his house has more followers than he does. But the very fact is, and you can look at it and go, wait, this is insane. But clearly, it's taking this information, it is making it available that enables the kind of cultural changes that we're talking about. And I, for one, I mean, if I can think of one thing that I found most exciting, and, frankly, I'm a big believer in and lover of hacker culture, is the simple fact that, we've got the CEO of this little company, Current Cost, that originally thought it was doing something just for single people in their homes and persuading utility companies that they should send these meters out. He now stands there and says, we have two customer sets, utilities and hackers. And that is tremendously interesting. So the fact that there is a community emerging in and around London, clearly I think there are a lot of people here at that sort of mass, but IBM and this is IBM from a grassroots perspective. These are not people paid to do this stuff. They're doing it because it is interesting. The simple fact is we've got a community building around electricity information. So the idea that basically there are some companies that have useful technology here. Patchbay is one, Arduino.it is one, and the ability to hack your house and install things in your water meter and so on and pull that information together, you can get much better effects when you can begin to, and this stuff is just open information. Create a portal, share the information. There's code sharing going on. There are new libraries being established every day. And that, to me, is really, really exciting. And the idea that, in terms of the 2.0 thing, we're taking this information, because in lots of ways, energy, what are we talking about? We're talking about metadata about electricity and how it's going around the grid and saying, wait, it's not just about my toaster, well, let's not say toaster, about my washing machine knowing the cheapest time to go off, and having that agreement with a power company. It's also about us taking control of our own destinies and saying, wait a second, how am I performing according to my peers? When should we all get together and watch a show? Maybe, let's not watch the Super Bowl live. Let's TiVo-ize that. Let's not watch EastEnders. Let's TiVo-ize that. And the idea that we can begin as a community to look at better ways to use and consume electricity, I think is tremendously exciting. So, again, hacker culture and the fact that communities can drive better effects. I mean, it's one thing to look at your meter and go, okay, this is an interesting thing, I should change my behavior. But as we all know, where you really get social and cultural change, it's within communities. And so I think, this is kind of my call to action. So there was a question there, is this happening in the States? Well, interestingly enough, there are some, again, this just happens to be a little cluster that I know. There are some guys in the States that because they saw this happening with some other IBM technologists, have got, they've ordered these current cost meters that were not designed to work on, basically on American electricity networks in order to start doing some of the same stuff. So, there are some initiatives, and frankly, if you know them, please let me know, because this is what we're really most excited by.
And even going beyond that, I mean, to my mind, that's phenomenal. That's really, really interesting stuff. But I'm trying to look beyond that and see what's coming beyond that. And I think it's great that the utilities are now starting to they're pricing real time using the smart grids, and they're all getting on board on that and rolling out smart grid projects.
Uh-oh, it looks like we just lost Tom on the audio. So James, can you just cover for him until he dials back in?
So what, did Tom drop out?
Yes, he did. So
okay.
I hope he's dialing right in.
I got all excited and I handed it back to him, and sure enough, I'm still on. So I don't know what the next slide is actually, because I think Tom was driving the slides. Let me see.
Maybe there's some questions you can answer.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Questions, because we only actually have about 12 minutes left. I mean, there have been some great questions coming already from the from the chat, and I hope we try to respond to some of that. But this is just a classic. I mean, barriers to participation, and that's what we're trying to break down. And again, from a call to action perspective, we have to agitate for this stuff. So, we really do need to, be demanding that our governments are doing this. Clearly, in the States at least, what a hugely different situation now with Obama, in charge. And so I think that let's encourage some of the encouraging things we're seeing, but demand change. We need to lower the barriers to entry. So I'd be happy to take a question.
All right. Can you hear me,
But
James?
if there aren't any, I'd be happy to just, keep tearing through the slides and...
Well, I did see, I'm trying to help Tom get back in. I did see a question early on when Tom was talking about deploying these sorts of savings in 3 to 5 years, and someone said, how would that ever be possible in a city like Los Angeles? So...
Oh, well, that's a great question. I think from a Los Angeles perspective, it could be that water, rather than energy, is the really big issue. I mean, it's just like Las Vegas. There are some that saying, Las Vegas within 10 years, from a water perspective, the water levels in that part of the world are really, really going down. And, I think from a broader sustainability standpoint, energy is one thing, but we really need to be looking at water. Clearly we have a bunch of tough challenges. So, if we think about the question from Emily Gertz, do you see political organizing as a primary means? It's certainly one of the means. So if we look at a city, like LA, for example, or probably even more so London, where there are all these buildings, how do you refit buildings to be more efficient? That's a really, really tough problem, and trying to work out a life cycle of, what should we agitate for? So, should I be agitating for more of this electricity stuff, or should I just be going and demanding that the government subsidizes better insulation? Because I think this notion of how do we refit existing infrastructure is super important. We're coming into, again, thinking about hacker culture and so on. It's always nice when you can do something in a green field, but you always have to interoperate, you always have to make existing systems work more effectively, and I think that's one of the areas where the politics really comes in. So the engineers, the technologists, the hackers, they can build this bright new future, but clearly the retrofit that we need to do across, all kinds of sectors, across housing and everything else, that is going to require some political input. It is going to require that basically we make some effort. So what are some small steps local governments can take? Actually, at least in the UK, but certainly in some other geographies in Europe, interestingly enough, the local government organizations have been ahead of central government. Central government has talked a lot. I've seen local government be quite effective in terms of purchasing and demanding equipment that actually has a lower energy footprint. So that's one of the things, federal and local governments, it's their purchasing power almost more than anything else that makes them so important in this space. And again, if we agitate, try and get them to understand how important this stuff is, they can demand that and really begin to drive the purchasing power that they have so that we can have more power efficient equipment across the board. So I think that's one of the areas that local government is already doing good work, and we can really encourage.
Just to jump back in there, sorry for disappearing on you suddenly. I was in the middle of a rant when I realized that I was talking to myself. I was saying about the kind of vision I have going forward, and right now the utility companies are looking at rolling out smart meters, and they see this as kind of the be-all and end-all, and personally I see that as the beginning, not the end. I think my smart meter, when it arrives, I want it to be net neutral. I don't want it to be tied to any particular utility. The utilities are going to be publishing real-time energy pricing. I want them not just to publish the real-time energy pricing. I want them to publish the real-time energy pricing plus the generation mix that goes to make up that price. So I want to see what percentage of that electricity I'm being delivered is from coal, what percentage is coming from wind, what percentage is coming from solar, what is coming from hydro, so that I want my meter to decide on the fly which utility to pull the energy from. So I want to be buying at all times the cheapest, greenest electricity from whichever provider is providing electricity. And I want that decision to be based on the publication that's coming from the utilities. That, when you start saying things like that and utilities around, you start to see people getting very, very, very uncomfortable in their chairs.
Yeah, and clearly, Tim Holohan, you're right. I mean, in the U.S. and everywhere else, I mean, utilities are basically monopolies, and that's one of the things we have to break down. I mean, we talked about this transition to energy and grids 2.0. I mean, if we think, just look at the telephone system. and the massive innovation that was unleashed when we began to break down some of those monopoly structures. I think the argument they have made is about, the sort of the ongoing, oh no, this is so important, we need to maintain the supply and stuff. But, frankly, from that perspective, if we look at the brownouts in the U.S., I mean, they're not stepping up to that either. So, quite frankly, yes, these are very much, in many cases, kind of classic monopolies, and that's another area where political will matters. I mean, I think one of the points I want to respond to in terms of John Aitchison, saying that the small efforts don't matter. I really think they do. I mean, we had actually a pretty good example of this. I was at an event last week, and again, sorry to mention the enterprisey companies again, but it was an IBM event. But I thought what was really interesting is they did this demo where they were showing the data center, and they had basically showed a way that you could align, so not just taking performance and availability information of your infrastructure, but energy consumption. And so what was really interesting is that the guys turned around, they just gave it to their guys in the data center in Austin and said, well, does this stuff work? And the guys in Austin, they were looking at it, and okay, they came back, and they went, wait a second, what the hell is happening? Every single day at 1 a.m., we have a 2% energy spike. Okay, it's only a 2% energy spike, but, in terms of the scale of the operation, it was certainly, 2%, that's a lot of electricity in those terms. I mean, a large data center might be the equivalent of 25,000 homes. And the simple fact is, you know what they found out when they looked at it and they began to correlate that with some of their other systems? It was a once-a-day virus scan that was kicked off at 1 a.m. every night across every single system on the network. So, it's one of these things, again, time shifting and TiVoization of our consumption patterns can be so valuable. But clearly, that 2% did make a difference, both in terms of dollars spent, but that is more energy. And if every data center across America saved 2%, that would not be, to be sniffed at. Now, clearly, consumption comes on, and that will get chewed up, but I actually do believe that small things, small changes can add up and make big differences.
Absolutely. So I think we need to start winding up now. Jock Gill had a great quote there last year where he said the electronet presumes that every citizen is a producer and seller of electricity as well as a consumer of electricity. So I think that sums up what we're saying here quite well. Electricity 2.0, you can see there some of the bullet points, and I apologize for this slide. We don't normally go for bullet points in slide decks. We avoid them as much as possible. But
Tom, I told you to get rid of these bullet points, man. You are so fired. I can't believe you gave the O'Reilly crowd bullet points. Damn it. Oh no, wait, this is the slide that I made.
So, second to last slide. Why is this important? Well, the 2007 IPCC Climate Change Synthesis Report said as global average temperature increase exceeds about 3.5 degrees, model projections suggest significant extinctions in the 40 to 70% range around the globe. That makes it pretty important. Why is it critical? Well, Rajendra Pachauri, and I'm probably murdering the pronunciation of his name, he's the chair of the IPCC, said last year, if there's no action before 2012, then it's too late. What we do in the next 2 to 3 years will determine our future. This is the defining moment. Now, Rajendra Pachauri, you've got to remember, was appointed as chair of the IPCC by the Bush administration. He was taking over from the previous incumbent who the Bush administration decided was too alarmist. So this is the conservative viewpoint. It's pretty critical. We need to fix the electrical grid, we need to fix the electrical networks globally and radically reduce our CO2 output. Thanks.
Well, that's pretty good. We only lost 10 attendees in an hour. That's if we could do that with electricity, we'd be in great shape.
That was excellent. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for doing this. Now, we've had a few questions about the slides. And I want to say that we have recorded this, and we'll make that available actually as a movie that you can watch on our site and on YouTube. And if you, gentlemen, want to put it on your site.
Great. I mean, we're all, just let let those flowers bloom. I mean, we already have, you know, the original version of this presentation online.
Slide
But
deck.
you know, any of that stuff is great.
Okay.
You know, let's just get this out there. So
Yeah.
you know, any media you wanna use is great, and just send us URLs and we'll pimp it too.
Oh,
If anyone wants
excellent.
a copy of it, feel free to ask me for a copy. Like I say, there's an earlier version on slide deck, and anyone who wants a copy of it, they're more than welcome to.
Wonderful. And I think James posted your email addresses, so you'll probably get a lot of email.
Well,
And,
hope so.
And I want to say that if people want to copy the chat, there are a lot of great resources posted in the chat window. If you want to copy that, the easiest way, you can either save it when you log out, but that happens quickly and people forget to, or if you can just do select all, copy, and paste it into a text file. And if you don't get a chance to do that, feel free to email me, and I can email you a copy of it. Just send it to Webcast, and Marcy just posted that, but it's actually, that's not the correct email address. It's singular, webcast@O'Reilly.com, and we'll send it. And that's about it. Thank you so much, gentlemen, especially for doing this in the evening. We really appreciate
No,
it.
I mean, you know, hey, we choose where we live. You know,
live in wonderful
and
places.
frankly, in terms of turning the dial, you know, we have a bunch of the clients to the West Coast and so on. So, but no, thank you for thanking us. You know, we appreciate that because yes, this is out of. I mean, for Tom, but this, you know, in Spain they're crazy. They don't even go to bed. You know.
Oh, that's true.
You know, they're probably going to go out for dinner with their kids now, and it's 8 p.m. You know what I'm saying?
What a
Just a
lie.
completely the Spanish. They're just so different.
We're Barney.
Great. Well, we'll see you in a couple weeks at ETech then, too.
Super.
Cool.
Thanks for
See you then.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.